Andy immediately booked the couple in Miami, Florida for 4 days and 5 nights. Jorge Alvarez was an assistant branch manager for Crossroads Bank in Leesburg, Indiana. On the 3rd day of a banking conference, sitting next to him at the lunch table was Phil Trapp, Senior Vice President of Flagstar Bank's Fort Wayne, Indiana branch. When Jorge saw the badge, he smiled to himself. What were the chances that he would remember the wife of the man sitting next to him at the conference in San Francisco? The 6 bank employees around the table discussed the topics of the day's seminar for a while, and then moved on to more personal conversations. Halfway through dinner, Georgie told Phil about their affair. "A couple of years ago, I helped your wife open your account in my branch," Georgie told Phil. "I appreciate this business. How long have you had your lake house?" Phil was completely confused. He handled all the banking and paid the bills himself. He knew nothing about the Crossroads Bank account. He hoped his mouth wasn't hanging open stupidly. "For about 10 years now. For the past 2 years, Rowley has lived there all summer. I visit her on weekends. Do you see her often?" "Actually, I don't see her. It's basically an online account," she told me. "But once or twice a week, I see her at the entrance when she tops up her account." Phil's brain was now working overtime. He knew that technically, Jorge shouldn't have told him anything about the account since Phil wasn't on it. Rowley went shopping specifically for her trip to Miami with Andy. She spent about $6,000 on several outfits, new shoes, and of course, several pieces of exotic lingerie. That money was a drop in the bucket compared to what she had put into her secret account, and Phil never saw her separate credit card bill. Rowley loved feeling Andy's toned body as they played. He was also very creative and took the time to learn about Rowley's preferences. Sex with Andy was more egalitarian than with most of her other partners, where she did everything she could to please her partner without caring about herself. If Rowley was honest with herself, she knew she was probably too emotionally attached to Andy. Even though it was just sex with the others, including Glenn, she knew she was slowly falling in love with Andy. Spending all this time together, Rowley knew it wasn't good for her marriage. Rowley left about 6 hours after Phil left for the airport. 4 days passed quickly for Rowley. The couple dined in nice restaurants, went dancing, went shopping, and spent time on the beach, alternating this with, in Rowley's opinion, amazing sex. It felt like she and Andy were newlyweds. On Friday's flight home, Rowley was calm and thoughtful. For the first time, she thought about her actions. Until this week, it was always just sex. It wasn't necessarily better sex. It was something new, different, and illegal. This week, everything changed. Rowley folded her hands in her lap, and her right hand touched the large wad of bills in her pocket. Andy reached out and covered both of her hands with one large hand. He knew who she was, the wife of one man, the mistress of another, paid sex for him and others. What if he had met her before her husband? Would he be her husband now? And if he were her husband now, would she cheat on him? When Phil walked through the door on Saturday night, both Phil and Rowley had a lot on their minds. Their greetings to each other were half-hearted at best, but both were so lost in their thoughts that they didn't even notice. There was no reunion lovemaking, not even reunion sex. Phil was glad to go back to work on Monday so he wouldn't have to be around his wife. He had to make several phone calls. Jorge Alvarez was surprised to hear from Phil Trapp on Monday afternoon, especially since Phil wasn't exactly Mr. Warmth at the San Francisco conference. At one of the dinners, they sat next to each other and seemed to get along, but suddenly Phil fell silent and did not say anything until the end of the dinner. For the rest of the conference, he practically avoided Jorge. "Jorge, I think I owe you an apology, and I need professional courtesy," Phil said after the pleasantries. Phil explained to Jorge that he did not know about his wife's Crossroads account and was caught off guard because Rowley had no reason to transfer the money to a private account. Although it was illegal and unethical, he asked Jorge to send him the account information out of professional courtesy. Jorge complied with the request. Phil was shocked to see that Rowley had accumulated $58,000 in her private account, including a $6,000 deposit made at 9:15 that morning. Most of the deposits were made while Rowley was living at the lake house, but there were deposits made every few weeks throughout the rest of the year. As a veteran of the banking industry, Phil knew exactly who to call when he needed investigative work and video surveillance. Since early May, Rowley has moved back to living on the lake full-time. She found it a little strange that Phil agreed to it so easily this year, after being reluctant to agree the previous 2 years. For a brief moment, she wondered if her husband was actually glad to see her out of the house. Could Phil be having an affair? Rowley's worries about Phil disappeared during her first Tuesday date with Glenn Zam at his lake house. It's been 3 weeks since the couple hooked up in Fort Wayne. It was a wonderful night and the morning after, Rowley thought, as Glenn dropped her off at her own lake house. She'll have a few hours to lounge on the terrace before getting ready for her first date of the summer season. She always liked to have sex in her bed when she wasn't with Glenn in his. Phil knew his marriage was over 5 minutes after the investigator began his report. In the month since Rowley returned to the lake house, she had sex with Glenn Zam 8 times at his house, and also had sex with 6 different men at the Trap cottage 7 times. On each occasion, at the Trap home, Rowley's associates handed her a wad of cash. The investigator also gave Phil a flash drive containing video footage of Rowley's activities in their home. Phil could hardly hold back his tears. Everything turned out to be much worse than he could have imagined. His Rowley turned out to be not only a cheater, but also did it for money. Phil looked at his watch for the 12th time. 30 minutes had passed since the light downstairs in the lake house went out and the light in his bedroom came on. From what he'd seen in the footage of his wife and her clients, by the time the 30 minutes were up, they'd be done with all the foreplay and moving on to the main part of their evening. Phil quietly entered the house and walked up the stairs. Because of the noise coming from the marital bedroom, he could probably walk into the house with a boombox slung over his shoulder, and neither of the 2 occupants would hear him. "Let's play until the end. We don't pay attention," Phil exclaimed, walking into the bedroom. "What the hell?" Arden began to shout, moving away from Rowley. "No!" Rowley screamed, trying to hide in the sheets. Phil walked up to his wife and handed her the ubiquitous manila envelope. Arden reached out and grabbed Phil's left arm, at which point Phil spun around and punched the naked man in the face with his right hand. Arden let out an ear-piercing scream as blood gushed from what had once been a chiseled nose. Phil reached down to the floor, grabbed Rowley's discarded white bikini panties and wiped the blood off his hand. He walked over to the room's main closet, grabbed a few items of clothing, and left the room, whistling a cheerful tune as he walked down the stairs. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, a thought struck him. "You probably won't get paid for today's work, baby." "Sorry," he shouted. Phil chuckled to himself and walked out the front door, leaving it wide open. Rowley had at least been smart enough not to try to contact Phil until Friday, hoping that she could persuade him to join her at the cottage for the weekend as usual. "Obviously, we need to talk," Rowley wrote to her husband. "Do you think so?" he answered. Rowley hoped that Phil would arrive on Friday evening as usual and stay over the weekend. She had to be content with the fact that he agreed to come on Saturday morning. Of course, Rowley was shocked when Phil showed up at the lake house on Wednesday night. Given that he brought divorce papers with him, he knew about her extracurricular activities in advance. How did this happen? How much did he know? He knew enough, that was certain, but she hoped he didn't know the whole story. Rowley had donuts and coffee ready when Phil showed up at the house Saturday morning. For Phil, the donuts were the highlight of the meeting. The couple sat in silence until Phil finished eating first. "I'm so sorry, Phil," Rowley began, looking into her coffee cup. "I'm especially sorry that you had to see it that evening." Phil was silent for several seconds. "I've seen it before, just not as close and personal," he said quietly. This time, Rowley was silent. She considered the implications of what her husband had just said. "I know, Phil. It may not seem like it, but I really love you, and only you." "I know it sounds corny, and it probably is, but it was just sex," she whispered. "A hell of a lot of sex, with a hell of a lot of guys. And that's just this year," Phil said sharply. "How long did this shit go on? The whole time you were here? What about when you were at home with me?" Rowley began to realize that her husband was not quite the mushroom in the dark that she thought he was. She decided that her answers must be closer to the truth than she had planned. Yes, it started the first summer I stayed here. I missed you and made a mistake. But I liked it, and I decided that since you are not here, then I am not taking anything away from you. Seriously? Phil interrupted. Aren't you taking anything away from me? Because I wasn't with you? Since when does fidelity have a nearby location clause? I must have missed that in the wedding vows. Shit. I could have had 3 years of fun with other women in Fort Wayne while you were here. Rowley finally raised her head and stared at the table. Her lips moved, but no sound came out of her mouth. And one more thing. It's not enough that you were a traitor, but also having sex for money. You didn't need the money, Rowley. It was all about sex with new and different men, and doing it in secret made it that much more exciting, she said. I never asked for money, but when they handed it to me, the thought that I had just been paid for sex made me do everything possible for my partner. You know, Phil, I don't do anything by halves. Phil nodded slowly. So, is there anything I can say to get us together, Phil? Anything? I don't want to get a divorce. I love you. More than your lover, Zam. Over the past few years, you've had almost as much sex with him as you have with me. What about the character Siegfried? I've seen the way you look at him when you're with him. Rowley blushed deeply. Somehow, Phil knew everything. There was little she could say in response. Maybe we should try going to a marriage counselor, Phil. Anything? I don't want to get a divorce. Yeah, well, I don't want my wife to be a slut either, but I guess sometimes you can't always get what you want, Phil said. Rowley and her lawyer were able to convince the judge hearing the divorce case to order marriage counseling. This lasted 1 session. When the counselor found out what Rowley had been doing for 3 years, she stopped counseling. I didn't ask them to do this. This money was given to me as a gift, Rowley cried when the consultant called a spade a spade. Yes, they may not be able to arrest you, but a rose by any other name, said the consultant. Have you ever thought about personal counseling, Mrs. Trapp? Phil was looking for something unusual to read and was browsing the nonfiction shelves at one of the Allen County Public Library branches. He was lost in thought when he heard what sounded like someone jumping up and down a few feet away from him. Turning around, he saw that it was indeed someone jumping up and down. Short blonde, about 5 feet tall, tried to get a book from the top shelf. Her short skirt levitated and fell with each jump, giving Phil a view of the black panties she was wearing. The girl blushed when she realized that Phil was watching her. Oh, sorry, she said to Phil, smoothing out her skirt. Could you get me that Hemingway book on the second shelf? Phil also blushed when he realized that the girl had caught him looking at her panties. Of course, no problem, he said, handing her the book she asked for. The short blonde had sparkling blue eyes and round cheeks, Phil noted, handing her the book. She was probably the same age as one of his children, but there was something in those eyes that captivated Phil. Have you read a lot of his works? Phil asked the young girl. At the moment, I've only read 3 of his books, the girl answered with a smile that revealed 2 rows of perfect teeth. I'm not as convinced as others that he was a great writer. Maybe for his time, but now some of the things he wrote do not stand up to criticism. I think he was half dud and half genius. Phil was stunned by the response. He felt the same way about Hemingway, but did not expect to hear this opinion from the young lady. What? Are you a Hemingway apologist or something? She asked. No, first of all, I'm shocked that the girl even reads a paper book. I thought you young people only read books on your iPad. But I'm also surprised because you're the first person I've met who agrees with my opinion of Hemingway. I believe he was a pompous talker who wasn't as good as everyone thought. The girl giggled. It wasn't a sound Phil had personally heard too often up close over the past year. I hope I'm not too annoying, miss, but could we continue this conversation over a good cup of coffee? Yes, that would be great. Let me look at this book first, she replied. The couple headed to the nearest Starbucks. Chantal Pearson was a 25-year-old marketing graduate from Indiana University. She worked as a copywriter for a small advertising agency in Fort Wayne. Phil told her about his life, including divorce. She found Phil as fascinating as he found her. When their meeting came to an end an hour later, she asked for his mobile phone. He decided that she needed to call and handed her the phone. She quickly typed numbers and letters for a few seconds and then returned the phone. Like this. I wrote down my number and name. I would love to repeat this with you, she said happily. Yeah, me too, Phil answered shyly. Phil spent the next few days thinking about the girl. She was the first woman he contacted after divorcing his wife. Still, he felt awkward because she was half his age. Several more days passed before he decided to make a phone call. Hello, I was hoping you would call, Chantal exclaimed enthusiastically. I really enjoyed your company that evening. How about we expand our plans and have dinner this time? How would you like to visit an oyster bar? Oh, I would really like to. I haven't been there for a long time. It's not a place I can go within my budget, she said. The couple were halfway through a fabulous dinner when Chantal addressed the elephant in the room. You're pretty cool for an older guy. You know it? You're the first guy in the last year who hasn't tried to undress me in the first half hour of a date. Either you're not interested in me, or you're a gentleman. What, exactly? Phil blushed and looked like a deer in headlights, which made Chantal giggly. I'm definitely interested in you, Phil said. But I'm also a gentleman. I've been like this all my life. My father would have beaten me to a pulp if some girl had said that I was messing around with her. But you're also a lifetime younger than me. How about we just enjoy this moment right now? She asked. You know, you might also be a lifetime smarter than me, Phil said. Rowley and Glenn Zom were just finishing up their date when Glenn asked her if she wanted to go on another date. She always enjoyed the dates Glenn arranged for her, and she had to admit that things were much easier now that she didn't have to worry about her ex-husband. In addition, she now had free weekends, which she often used for dates. How would you feel about a younger guy this time? Let's say someone around 30? Glenn asked. If only he gets your approval. You know I trust you, Rowley replied. Rowley's date was the son of one of Glenn's friends. He was a former college basketball player and was still in good physical shape. Although he was not distinguished by the sophistication of many of Rowley's other companions, he had youth and physical strength on his side. While enjoying sex, Rowley admitted that physically the young man was a little larger than she was used to. God, I need a nap, she said to herself as the young man handed her a wad of bills as he walked out the door. Phil was amazed that despite the age difference between him and Chantal, they were still dating 6 months later. On the third date, they entered into an intimate relationship. Although he was not physically the same person as he was 25 years ago, Phil made up for it with experience, enthusiasm, and love. Although she had only a few suitors with whom she could compare him, Chantal considered him an excellent lover. They hugged after an exciting session of lovemaking. Phil loved to cuddle after lovemaking and taught the young woman to appreciate this act. After a few minutes, Phil felt her body tense. He looked down and saw that she was looking at him with an unreadable expression on her face. Phil, you know I love you, right? Chantal whispered. Phil was sure he knew where this was going and, sighing heavily, rolled onto his back. No, Phil, all wrong, Chantal quickly stammered, realizing what Phil was thinking. I think we're great together, but I think you deserve better. The best? What are you? Hardly, honey, Phil chuckled. Well, what would you say about me plus 25 years? Eh? Phil drawled. There is only one woman in the whole world who could be better for you than me, and that is my mother. Could you do me one little favor and ask her out for once, please? Your mom? Seriously? But wouldn't it be strange if we ended up here? Chantal blinked her blue eyes and gave Phil her most charming smile. Shit, he whispered. Phil was shocked when he picked up Lori Lala Pearson for their date 2 weeks later. Chantal told Phil that her mother was 25 years older, but if Phil didn't know better, he would have thought it was Chantal's older sister. The resemblance between them was uncanny, except that Lala had light pink blonde hair. Lala was 2 years younger than Phil, 50, and had been married to Chantal's father for 18 years before divorcing him because he was a chronic cheater. As Chantal explained to Phil, she and her father had reconciled after several years of separation. However, her mother still doesn't talk to her ex. Phil and Lala enjoyed their date, although Lala noticed him looking at her askance several times during the evening. "What?" she finally asked. "You and your daughter are so similar that it's almost scary," Phil answered. "It's like dating sisters." How much did you girls talk before this date? Should I have performance anxiety?" Lala giggled. Sounded just like Chantal. Phil liked the sound, but still thought it was weird. "It's up to you. I didn't make any specific plans. Chantal trusts you completely, so I decided that I would just follow your example. None of us are kids anymore, right?" "I guess that takes some of the pressure off then," Phil said. "But I have to warn you, I'm not as flexible as my daughter," Lala said. "I understand perfectly," Phil grinned. At the end of the evening, the couple ended up at Phil's. It was the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. Rowley was planning a family dinner. The children were due to arrive on Thursday morning, and Phil plus one other person to arrive in the afternoon to allow time for food. However, ahead of the big day, Rowley was enjoying her new favorite client, Jason LaForge, 30, and one of his friends, Tommy Wickersham. Rowley met Jason immediately after her divorce from Phil, and he quickly became her favorite due to his age and energy. He asked Rowley if she would be willing to have her first threesome, and after some hesitation, she agreed. They were in the midst of it when Rowley's youngest son, Robbie, entered the lake house using the key he had. As he led the young woman into the house, he stopped in his tracks when he looked into the kitchen and saw his mother entertaining a couple of guests. "Mother!" he shouted in despair. "We have to go!" Robbie said to the young woman who followed him into the house. The girl stood frozen in place, watching what was happening in the kitchen while Robbie tried to push her back out the door. Her introduction as Robbie's fiancée will have to wait until later. "Oh God, no!" Rowley screamed, pulling away from her young lovers. Phil's phone rang before Robbie pulled the car out of the driveway at the lake house. "Oh shit, Dad?" She was having sex with two young guys at the same time when Claire and I walked into the house. "How can I face her again?" Robbie blurted out, annoyed when Phil answered the phone. "Wait." "What?" answered Phil. "Slow down and talk to me, Robbie." Robbie explained to Phil that he had come home a day early to celebrate and introduce his parents to his fiancée. He wanted to surprise his mother and did not call, but entered the house using his key. It was a surprise for him. "You must remember, Robbie, that your mother is now a single woman and does not have to answer to anyone for what she does in the privacy of her own home. In the future, you should probably call before using your key, or maybe even give it away," Phil said. "I can't believe you, of all people, are defending what she allows herself to do, Dad." Phil thought for a second and then chuckled. Teaching children is a life's work, he thought to himself. "If you were lucky enough to entertain two girls in a room, would you consider yourself immoral, Robbie?" asked Phil. "I would consider myself dead because Claire would kill me," Robbie replied. "And if you weren't engaged, what then?" said Phil. "Just because your mother is over 50 doesn't mean she's not sexy." "Well, I can tell you this, Dad. She'll get a +1 invitation to the wedding like everyone else, not a +2, Robbie jokes. "I think that's fair," Phil said. Robbie and Claire spent the night at Phil's house. The next day, Thanksgiving, everyone went to the lake house to eat turkey and all the other dishes. Rowley pulled her son and his fiancée aside and apologized as they pulled up to the lake house. When Phil entered the house, he looked at Rowley and silently shook his head. She blushed appropriately. After a half-dozen dates with Layla, Phil realized he had broken up with Chantal, but he didn't want their friendship to die, so he called her and set up a lunch date. Chantal, in turn, was delighted with the relationship that Phil had with her mother. "But how would you feel if we went further, Chantal?" "I don't want this to be awkward for any of us," Phil said. "I'm fine, baby. Remember, it was I who gave you to your mother," she said, smiling widely. Okay, you're right. But I would still like to keep you in my world as a friend, little minx. I really liked you." "What about family?" She was inspired. I would make an excellent adopted daughter, you know. Mom thinks I'm a great daughter. You're as thin as a pie in the face, Phil said. It's only been 6 dates. Yes, but we also had a lot of dates. Can't you just transfer my account to her? Phil put his head in his hands and shook his head. He raised his head, smiling widely. You two would make a great team, half a pint squared. She giggled and smiled. Don't wait too long, Phil. And if it doesn't work out, don't hurt her. I could never hurt any of you, Phil said. I'm partial to fairies, you know. 6 months later, Phil asked Lala to marry him. A month after that, she moved into his house. To Robbie and Claire's wedding, Rowley took her good friend Glenn Zame and Phil took his fiancée Lala. The two couples met face to face for the first time when they sat next to each other in the row of the groom's parents minutes before the ceremony began. So, we finally met Phil. I'm Glenn Zame, Rowley's friend, Zame said, approaching Phil with his hand outstretched. Phil looked at Zame blankly and did not extend his hand. As I understand it, friend and mediator, Phil said loud enough for only the 4 to hear. Yes, whatever, Zame said, removing his hand. Rowley glared at her ex-husband. She was too busy to notice that Claire's mother was also looking at her with the same fury. Claire told her parents about what she saw at the lake house a year ago. Robbie had introduced his mother to Claire's mother the night before at the rehearsal dinner. As Rowley began to step forward for the expected hug, the other woman squeezed her shoulder tightly, stopping the movement. She looked up in shock and blushed deeply, realizing that Claire's mother had heard about the date at the lake house. Claire's mother hugged Lala without hesitation, and it was obvious that the two women had already spent time in each other's presence. Rowley understood that she was an extra woman. Glenn Zame wasn't thrilled when the county health department told him his sex partner had contracted syphilis and he needed to get tested and get results back within a week. Fuck it, Rowley. I warned you about these young guys who always think they're invulnerable, he shouted to her on the phone. Rowley pulled the phone away from her ear as he screamed. She sat on the edge of the bed and sobbed. She learned about her sexually transmitted disease the day before at the doctor's office. The continued burning pain in her perineum told her she was in big trouble. The next day, Rowley learned she had an even more serious problem. In subsequent years, several more houses were built on the street where Rowley lived. One of them belonged to a famous doctor and his wife who found out exactly what Rowley was doing. Glenn Zame's lawyer was good, and given that the arrest was Rowley's first, she was sentenced to only 1 year in prison with 6 months probation, although she could have gotten up to 6 years on the felony charge. Worse than the verdict, however, was the impact the crime and the ensuing publicity had on her family and life in general. Her children and parents were heartbroken. So that day when I found you at your house having sex with those 2 guys, it was business. Oh God, Mom, Robbie said in a telephone conversation a few days after Rowley's arrest. How many guys have you done this with? Rowley didn't answer the last question, hoping it was just a bad reaction to the situation and not an actual question. While Rowley spent her days in orange, Lala chose cornflower blue for her wedding dress. Robbie was his father's best man, and Chantal was her mother's maid of honor. Rowley's conviction spurred Kosciuszko County prosecutors to further investigate Glenn Zame's case, especially with the support of several of Zame's neighbors. At first, Zame laughed off the investigation, but as it spread to several cities in which he had dealerships and several areas of his various businesses, it became a serious concern. Negative publicity associated with Zame being investigated for his involvement in such a business led to the sharp decline of his dealerships. Zame lost millions when he sold his dealerships 2 years later. Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one. Listening to the next one.